in the depths of a moonless night, in a forgotten corner of ancient Greece, a king committed an act so vile, so utterly profane, that it would echo through millennia and birth one of humanity's most enduring terrors. This was not a crime of passion or war. This was something far more sinister, a deliberate desecration that would tear open the veil between the human and the beast, creating a curse that would haunt our species for over 2,000 years. This is the story of the first werewolf, not the romanticized creature of modern fiction, not the tortured hero of silver screen fantasies, but the original monster, a being born from an act so heinous that the gods themselves recoiled in horror and delivered a punishment that would define the very nature of lycanthropy forever. Tonight, we journey to the shadowed valleys of Arcadia, to the court of King Lycaon, where a single moment of unspeakable evil would transform not just one man, but the collective nightmare of humanity itself. This is not just the origin of a monster. This is the birth of a curse that would spread across continents, inspire countless tales of terror, and reveal the darkest truths about the beast that lurks within us all. Long before the werewolf became the stuff of Hollywood legends, before it prowled through medieval forests or terrorized Victorian London, the seeds of its existence were planted in the ancient world. The earliest whispers of human transformation into wolf form can be traced to the very cradle of civilization itself. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, written over 4,000 years ago in the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, we find the goddess Ishtar transforming a shepherd into a wolf as punishment for rejecting her advances. Yet this fleeting reference was merely the shadow of something far more profound to come. For it was in the rugged mountains of ancient Greece, in a land where gods walked among mortals and divine justice was swift and terrible, that the true foundation of werewolf mythology would be laid. Here, in the kingdom of Arcadia, ruled a man whose name would become forever synonymous with the curse of lycanthropy. His name was Lycaon, and his story would birth a legend that would outlive empires. The word itself tells us everything we need to know about the connection between this ancient king and the monsters that followed. Lycanthropy, from the Greek words lykos meaning wolf and anthropos meaning man, carries within its very syllables the memory of King Lycaon. This was no coincidence. This was a linguistic scar, a permanent reminder of the moment when humanity first crossed the line into something far more terrible. But who was this King Lycaon, and what drove him to commit an act so monstrous that it would echo through the ages? According to the ancient sources, Lycaon was the king of Arcadia, a mountainous region in the heart of the Peloponnese. His kingdom was wild and untamed, a place where the boundary between civilization and the primitive forces of nature was always thin. The people of Arcadia were known throughout the ancient world as fierce and independent, more comfortable in the company of wolves and bears than in the marble halls of more civilized cities. Lycaon ruled over this savage land with absolute authority. He was said to have 50 sons, each one ruling a different settlement throughout his kingdom. By all accounts, he was a powerful and successful monarch, commanding respect and fear in equal measure. Yet beneath this facade of royal authority, something darker festered. For Lycaon harbored within his heart a terrible pride, a hubris that would ultimately prove his undoing. The ancient Greeks understood that pride was the most dangerous of all human failings. They had a word for it, hybris, and they believed that those who allowed it to consume them would inevitably face the wrath of the gods. Lycaon embodied this fatal flaw perfectly. He was not content merely to rule over mortals. He wanted to test the gods themselves, to prove that his cunning was superior to their divine wisdom. This arrogance would manifest itself in the most horrific way imaginable. For Lycaon devised a plan so twisted, so utterly blasphemous, that it would shake the very foundations of the cosmic order. He would invite the king of the gods himself, mighty Zeus, to dine at his table. But the meal he planned to serve would be like no other in the history of hospitality. The stage was set for a confrontation that would redefine the relationship between human and beast forever. Zeus, the all-seeing father of gods and men, had heard disturbing rumors about the increasing wickedness of humanity. Some whispered that mortals had grown so corrupt that they no longer deserved divine protection. Others claimed that the age of heroes was ending, and that a new, darker chapter in human history was about to begin. Curious about these reports, Zeus decided to walk among mortals in disguise, testing their virtue and piety. His journey would take him to many kingdoms, but it was in Arcadia, at the court of King Lycaon, that he would encounter evil in its purest form. When Zeus arrived at Lycaon's palace, he appeared as a humble traveler seeking shelter. The laws of hospitality, sacred to all Greeks, demanded that any guest be treated with respect and offered food and lodging. Lycaon welcomed the stranger, but his welcome masked a sinister purpose, for the king suspected that this was no ordinary mortal who stood before him, and his pride demanded that he put this suspicion to the ultimate test. What happened next would become the stuff of legend, a tale so dark that even the ancient storytellers struggled to find words adequate to describe it. For Lycaon had prepared a feast unlike any other, a meal that would reveal the depths of human depravity and forever change the relationship between man and wolf. The details of Lycaon's crime vary slightly between different ancient sources, but the core of the horror remains consistent. In the most widely accepted version of the tale, Lycaon murdered his own son, Nyctimus. But this was not a crime of passion or madness. This was a calculated act of ultimate sacrilege. The king took his son's body and butchered it like an animal, cooking the flesh and serving it to his divine guest. This was Lycaon's test. If the stranger before him was truly Zeus, the all-knowing god would recognize human flesh when he tasted it. If he was merely a mortal, he would eat the meal unknowingly, and Lycaon would have his answer. It was a gamble that revealed the king's complete lack of understanding about the nature of divine justice. For Zeus needed no taste of the abomination to know what had been placed before him. The moment the plate was set upon the table, the god's wrath erebolt. The Veriptid, with the force of a thunder air in the hall, crackled with divine fury as Zeus rose from his seat, his mortal disguise falling away like a discarded cloak. Lightning flickered in his eyes, and thunder rolled from his voice as he pronounced judgment upon the king who had dared to serve him the flesh of his own child. But Zeus's punishment would not be death. Death was too simple, too clean for a crime of such magnitude. Instead, the god would give Lycaon exactly what his actions had revealed him to be. If the king could murder and cannibalize his own son like a wild beast, then a wild beast he would become. The transformation that followed was described by the Roman poet Ovid in verses that still send chills down the spine over 2 millennia later. Lycaon's human form began to shift and change, his noble features twisting into something savage and alien. His garments melted away, replaced by coarse grey fur that sprouted from every pore. His arms elongated into powerful legs, his fingers became claws, and his mouth stretched into a muzzle filled with razor-sharp teeth. But perhaps most horrifying of all was what remained unchanged. Behind those yellow wolf eyes, Lycaon's human consciousness persisted, trapped forever within a beast's body. He retained his memories, his intelligence, his understanding of what he had become and why. This was not merely a physical transformation. This was a perfect fusion of human cunning with animal savagery, creating something far more dangerous than either could be alone. As the newly transformed werewolf fled into the mountains of Arcadia, howling his rage and despair into the night, Zeus restored young Nyctimus to life. Justice had been served, but the consequences of Lycaon's crime would ripple outward through history like stones thrown into still water. For in that moment of divine retribution, something new and terrible had been born into the world. The first werewolf had been created, and with it, the template for every lycanthrope that would follow. The curse that began with Lycaon, did not end with his transformation, for the ancient Greeks understood that such profound violations of the natural order create ripples that spread far beyond their origin point. The werewolf was not merely a single monster, but the beginning of a contagion that would infect humanity's collective soul for millennia to come. In the mountains of Arcadia, where Lycaon now prowled as a beast, the local population began to whisper of strange encounters. Shepherds spoke of a wolf that walked upright, whose eyes held an intelligence too human to be natural. Travelers reported attacks by a creature that seemed to know their names, that stalked them with a cunning no ordinary predator possessed. The boundary between man and beast had been shattered, and something new and terrible now roamed the earth. But the true horror of Lycaon's curse lay not in his individual transformation, but in what it represented. The ancient world was governed by the principle of divine justice, where punishment must fit the crime. Zeus had not simply transformed a man into a wolf out of arbitrary cruelty. He had revealed what Lycaon had already become through his actions. The king's willingness to murder and cannibalize his own child had stripped away his humanity long before his body changed to match. This became the fundamental law of lycanthropy that would echo through every subsequent werewolf tale. To become a werewolf, one must first become a monster in their heart. The physical transformation is merely the outward manifestation of an inner corruption that has already taken root. Lycaon's curse established that werewolves are not random victims of supernatural affliction, but individuals whose moral decay has progressed to the point where their beast nature can no longer be contained within human form. The Greeks had a profound understanding of the connection between Mount Lycaon and the curse of lycanthropy. This was no ordinary mountain, but a sacred site where the boundaries between the mortal and divine worlds grew thin. Archaeological evidence suggests that human sacrifice may have been practiced here over 3,000 years ago, with burial remains found directly within Zeus's ash altar, adjacent to stone platforms used for ritual dedications. Local legends told of secret rites performed on the mountain's summit, where initiates into the cult of Zeus Lycaos would undergo their own form of transformation. According to these accounts, a participant in the sacred mysteries would be turned into a wolf for a period of 9 years. If they could resist the urge to consume human flesh during this time, they would be restored to human form. But if they gave in to their bestial hunger, they would remain wolves forever. This ritual lycanthropy reveals something crucial about how the ancient world understood the werewolf curse. It was not seen as a random supernatural affliction, but as a test of human will and moral strength. The transformation into wolf form was a trial by fire, a way of determining whether the essential humanity of an individual could survive contact with their most primitive instincts. The cult of Zeus Lycaos preserved the memory of Lycaon's crime, while also creating a controlled environment for others to face similar temptations. These ritual transformations were a form of sacred theatre, allowing initiates to experience the horror of losing their humanity while still maintaining the possibility of redemption. Unlike Lycaon, whose transformation was permanent punishment for an unforgivable crime, these voluntary werewolves could return to human society if they proved their moral worth. This distinction between cursed and voluntary lycanthropy would become a recurring theme in werewolf mythology. The curse of the first werewolf established that some transformations are irreversible consequences of moral failure. But the ritual traditions of Mount Lycaon suggested that lycanthropy could also be a temporary state, a trial that could be overcome through strength of character and moral discipline. The influence of Lycaon's tale spread far beyond the borders of Greece, carried by traders, soldiers, and storytellers to every corner of the ancient world. As the story traveled, it evolved and adapted to local beliefs and customs, but its core message remained unchanged. The werewolf represented the ultimate consequence of moral corruption, the point at which humanity's veneer of civilization crumbles to reveal the savage beast beneath. In the northern forests of Europe, Germanic and Celtic tribes developed their own werewolf traditions that bore striking similarities to the Greek tales. These cultures had their own words for the wolfman, their own rituals and beliefs about transformation, but the underlying pattern remained consistent. The werewolf was always a figure who had crossed some fundamental moral boundary, whose actions had stripped away their right to human form. Among the Norse peoples, the concept of lycanthropy became intertwined with their warrior culture through the legendary Ulfhednar, the wolf-coated fighters who served Odin, the god of war and death. These were not cursed individuals like Lycaon, but elite warriors who deliberately sought to channel the savage power of the wolf in battle. They would don wolf skins and enter a trance-like state of fury known as Berserkergang, becoming living embodiments of controlled lycanthropy. The Ulfhednar represented a fascinating inversion of the Lycaon myth. Where the Greek king's transformation was punishment for his crimes, these Norse warriors used lycanthropy as a source of sacred power. They had learned to harness the beast within without losing their essential humanity, transforming into wolves only when battle demanded it, and returning to human form when the fighting ended. This warrior tradition reveals that lycanthropy was not always viewed as a curse in the ancient world. For certain cultures, the ability to take on wolf characteristics was seen as a divine gift, a way of accessing primal powers that civilized humanity had forgotten. The Ulfhednar were respected and feared throughout the Viking world, their wolf-like ferocity in battle making them legendary figures whose exploits were recorded in sagas and poems. Yet even these voluntary werewolves lived under the shadow of Lycaon's curse. The line between controlled transformation and permanent corruption was always thin, and many warriors who embraced the wolf spirit too completely found themselves unable to return to human society. The Berserkergang could become a permanent state, leaving former heroes as savage outcasts who prowled the wilderness like the king of Arcadia himself. The Roman Empire's encounter with werewolf beliefs came through their conquest of territories where these ancient traditions flourished. Roman writers like Ovid and Pliny the Elder documented werewolf tales with a mixture of fascination and skepticism, treating them as curious folklore while recognizing their power over the popular imagination. Ovid's retelling of the Lycaon myth in his Metamorphoses became the definitive version of the story, his poetic language giving permanent form to the horror of the first transformation. Through Roman literature and lore, werewolf beliefs spread throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Roman soldiers carried these tales to the furthest frontiers of the empire, where they merged with local supernatural traditions to create new variations on the lycanthropy theme. The curse that began with one Greek king had become a global phenomenon, a shared nightmare that transcended cultural and geographical boundaries. But it was during the medieval period that the werewolf would undergo its most profound transformation, evolving from a figure of ancient mythology into something far more sinister and immediate. The rise of Christianity would fundamentally alter how lycanthropy was understood and feared, turning the werewolf from a symbol of divine justice into an agent of pure evil. The early Christian church struggled to reconcile werewolf beliefs with their theological framework. Some church fathers dismissed lycanthropy as pagan superstition, arguing that only God had the power to transform human nature. Others saw werewolves as instruments of Satan, demons in wolf form sent to terrorize the faithful. Still others believed that lycanthropy was a genuine curse, but one that could be overcome through prayer, holy water, and divine intervention. This theological uncertainty created a climate of fear and confusion that would define medieval attitudes toward werewolves. The ancient understanding of lycanthropy as divine punishment for moral failure gave way to a simpler and more terrifying concept: werewolves as servants of the devil, creatures whose very existence threatened the salvation of human souls. The medieval werewolf was no longer bound by the moral logic that governed Lycaon's curse. These new monsters could be created through demonic pacts, magical ointments, or simple contact with other werewolves. The transformation was no longer a reflection of inner corruption, but could strike anyone, making every human being a potential monster. This democratization of lycanthropy transformed the werewolf from a rare consequence of extreme evil into a widespread threat that could emerge anywhere, at any time. Medieval chronicles and court records document numerous werewolf trials across Europe, where individuals confessed under torture to transforming into wolves and committing terrible crimes. These trials reveal how completely the werewolf had evolved from its classical origins, becoming a catch-all explanation for serial murder, cannibalism, and other crimes that medieval society struggled to comprehend. The trials that swept across Europe from the 15th to the 17th centuries represent one of the darkest chapters in the evolution of werewolf mythology. What had begun as a tale of divine justice in ancient Greece had transformed into something far more sinister, a weapon of terror that could be wielded against anyone who fell outside the narrow boundaries of medieval Christian society. In the French village of Poligny in 1521, two men named Pierre Bourgeot and Michel Verdun were dragged before ecclesiastical authorities on charges that would have seemed impossible to the ancient Greeks who first told the tale of Lycaon. These men confessed, under the persuasion of hot irons and the rack, that they had made a pact with the devil himself. They claimed to possess a magical ointment that could transform them into wolves, and they described in horrifying detail how they had used this power to hunt and devour children throughout the countryside. Their confessions, extracted through methods that guaranteed the answers the inquisitors wanted to hear, painted a picture of lycanthropy that bore little resemblance to the moral logic of the original myth. These were not men who had committed acts of cannibalism and been punished with transformation by an outraged god. Instead, they were portrayed as willing servants of Satan, who had actively sought the power to become beasts so they could indulge their most depraved appetites. The fire that consumed Bourgeot and Verdun at the stake was fueled by more than wood and pitch. It was fed by a fundamental shift in how European society understood the relationship between human nature and the beast within. The werewolf was no longer a consequence of moral failure, but had become a choice, a deliberate embrace of evil that could tempt anyone weak enough to succumb to diabolic influence. This transformation of the werewolf from divine punishment to demonic gift created a climate of paranoia that would define European attitudes toward lycanthropy for centuries. If anyone could become a werewolf through a simple pact with the devil, then everyone was potentially suspect. The neighbor who kept to himself, the widow who lived alone with her cats, the stranger who arrived in town during a particularly harsh winter, all could be hiding the terrible secret of their bestial nature. The medieval church's struggle to understand lycanthropy within Christian theology led to increasingly elaborate explanations for how such transformations were possible. Some theologians argued that werewolves were the result of demonic possession, evil spirits that invaded human bodies and forced them to take on wolf characteristics. Others maintained that the devil could create the illusion of transformation, making observers believe they were seeing a wolf when in fact they were witnessing a human driven mad by supernatural influence. Thomas Aquinas, the great scholastic philosopher, wrote extensively about the power of angels and demons to manipulate the physical world. His dictum that all angels, both good and evil, possessed the natural ability to transform human bodies provided theological justification for werewolf beliefs, while maintaining that only divine or infernal powers could accomplish such miraculous changes. This scholarly approach to lycanthropy created a bizarre fusion of classical learning and medieval superstition. Monks copying ancient texts would encounter the story of Lycaon and struggle to reconcile it with Christian doctrine. Some interpreted Zeus's punishment of the impious king as a prefiguration of God's judgment on sinners, arguing that the pagan myth contained hidden Christian truths. Others dismissed the Greek tales as demonic deceptions designed to lead believers astray from the true faith. The result of this theological confusion was a werewolf mythology that incorporated elements from multiple traditions, while lacking the coherent moral framework that had defined the original stories. Medieval werewolves could be created through sin, sorcery, demonic pacts, magical ointments, or simple contact with other lycanthropes. The transformation could be voluntary or involuntary, permanent or temporary, a curse or a gift, depending on the specific circumstances and the theological inclinations of whoever was telling the tale. This multiplicity of explanations for lycanthropy reflected the deep anxiety that medieval society felt about the boundaries between human and animal nature. The ordered world of feudalism, with its rigid hierarchies and clearly defined social roles, was constantly threatened by the possibility that civilization itself was merely a thin veneer covering humanity's fundamentally bestial character. The werewolf embodied this fear perfectly. It was a creature that could walk among humans undetected, that could participate in the daily rituals of Christian society while harboring a monstrous secret. The medieval werewolf was not confined to the wilderness like its classical predecessors, but could emerge from within the heart of civilization itself, revealing that the greatest threats to human society came not from external enemies, but from the corruption that festered within. French chroniclers of the medieval period documented case after case of individuals who claimed to transform into wolves during the dark hours between sunset and dawn. These accounts, whether born of genuine delusion, calculated deception, or simple storytelling, painted a consistent picture of lycanthropy as a nocturnal curse that drove otherwise ordinary people to commit acts of unspeakable violence. The werewolf of medieval France was typically described as a solitary figure, cursed to spend 7 or 9 years in wolf form before being restored to human shape. Unlike the permanent transformation that befell King Lycaon, these temporary lycanthropes retained the hope of eventual redemption, though few were said to survive their bestial period with their sanity intact. The number 7 appears repeatedly in these medieval werewolf tales, echoing ancient beliefs about the mystical significance of certain numbers. 7 was considered a number of completion and perfection in Christian numerology, representing the days of creation and the gifts of the Holy Spirit. That werewolf curses should last for 7 years suggested a divine logic at work, a period of penance that must be endured before forgiveness could be granted. German folklore developed its own rich tradition of werewolf stories that emphasized the connection between lycanthropy and the wild forests that covered much of Central Europe. The German werewolf, or werewolf, was often portrayed as a guardian of the woodland realm, a creature that had traded its humanity for the power to protect the ancient groves from human encroachment. These Germanic werewolves retained some of the positive characteristics that had defined their Norse predecessors, the Ulfhednar. They were not necessarily evil creatures, but rather beings who had chosen to embrace their animal nature in order to fulfill some greater purpose. The German tradition recognized that lycanthropy could be a form of sacred duty, a sacrifice of human comfort and society in service of protecting something even more valuable. The forests of Germany were seen as repositories of ancient wisdom and power, places where the old gods still held sway despite the triumph of Christianity. Those who became werewolves in these tales were often portrayed as the last guardians of this primordial knowledge, individuals who had willingly accepted transformation in order to preserve secrets that would otherwise be lost to the advancing tide of civilization. This more nuanced view of lycanthropy created a complex moral landscape where werewolves could be simultaneously feared and respected. The German werewolf was dangerous, certainly, but its danger served a purpose that transcended simple predation. It was a reminder that humanity's relationship with the natural world was not one of simple dominion, but of mutual dependence and responsibility. Scandinavian countries preserved perhaps the most complete record of pre-Christian werewolf beliefs, maintaining oral traditions that stretched back to the Viking Age and beyond. These northern tales spoke of entire families cursed with lycanthropy, bloodlines tainted by ancient crimes that condemned generation after generation to spend portions of their lives in wolf form. The Scandinavian werewolf was often bound by strict rules and limitations that reflected the harsh moral code of Northern European society. These creatures could only transform at certain times of the year, usually during the darkest months of winter, when the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead grew thin. Their transformations were tied to the cycles of nature itself, making them as much a part of the natural order as the changing seasons or the migration of animals. These northern werewolves retained their human intelligence while in wolf form, allowing them to serve as bridges between the human and animal worlds. They could communicate with ordinary wolves, understand the language of ravens, and navigate the spirit world that existed parallel to the physical realm. This shamanic aspect of lycanthropy connected the werewolf tradition to the broader religious practices of pre-Christian Scandinavia, where transformation into animal form was seen as a mark of spiritual power rather than moral corruption. The gradual Christianization of Scandinavia forced these ancient werewolf traditions underground, where they persisted in folk tales and local customs long after the official conversion of the population. The Church's campaign against pagan beliefs transformed the werewolf from a figure of spiritual significance into a creature of pure evil, but it could not entirely erase the memory of what lycanthropy had once represented. Slavic folklore developed its own distinctive werewolf traditions that emphasized the connection between lycanthropy and the world of the dead. In these Eastern European tales, werewolves were often the spirits of individuals who had died violent or unnatural deaths, their restless souls taking on wolf form to continue their earthly business or seek revenge against those who had wronged them in life. The Slavic werewolf was thus both living creature and undead spirit, a being that existed in the liminal space between life and death. This dual nature made it one of the most feared supernatural entities in Eastern European folklore, as it combined the physical threat of a predatory animal with the implacable malice of a vengeful ghost. These Slavic traditions recognized that lycanthropy could be inherited, passed down through family lines like a genetic trait or a hereditary curse. Children born to werewolf parents were said to carry the potential for transformation within their blood, though whether this potential manifested depended on their actions and the circumstances of their lives. The concept of hereditary lycanthropy added a new dimension to werewolf mythology, suggesting that the curse initiated by King Lycaon could persist across generations, creating entire bloodlines marked by the capacity for bestial transformation. This hereditary element would later become a cornerstone of modern werewolf fiction, providing a biological explanation for lycanthropy that seemed more plausible to audiences increasingly influenced by scientific thinking. As werewolf beliefs spread across medieval Europe, they began to intersect with other supernatural traditions, creating hybrid mythologies that incorporated elements from vampire lore, witch beliefs, and demonic possession narratives. The werewolf became part of a larger supernatural ecosystem, a creature that could interact with vampires, serve witches, or be summoned by demons to carry out their malevolent purposes. This integration of werewolf mythology with other supernatural traditions reflected the medieval world's understanding of evil as a unified force that could manifest in multiple forms. The devil was seen as the ultimate source of all supernatural corruption, and his various servants, whether werewolves, vampires, or witches, were understood to be different facets of the same fundamental threat to human salvation. The medical understanding of lycanthropy also evolved during the medieval period, as physicians and scholars attempted to provide rational explanations for the werewolf phenomenon. Ancient medical texts described a condition called melancholia lupina, a form of madness that caused individuals to believe they had transformed into wolves. Medieval doctors expanded on these classical sources, developing elaborate theories about the humoral imbalances that could produce lycanthropic delusions. And so we return to that moonless night in ancient Arcadia, where a king's unspeakable crime tore open a wound in the fabric of reality that has never truly healed. From Lycaon's first howl echoing through the mountains to the werewolf trials that terrorized medieval Europe, we have traced the dark evolution of humanity's most enduring curse. The beast that Zeus unleashed upon the world was never just one monster, but a mirror reflecting our deepest fears about the savage nature that lurks beneath civilization's fragile surface. Every werewolf tale that followed, every transformation, every hunt, carries within it the genetic memory of that original sin committed in the halls of a forgotten palace. The curse of lycanthropy endures because it speaks to an uncomfortable truth, that the line between human and beast is far thinner than we dare to admit. Thank you for joining me in the shadows. Until next time, remember that some hungers can never truly be satisfied.